Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice. You women of Lamech, listen to my speech. Yes, I will kill a man for a wound, and a boy for a stripe. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. The Sunnites and the Annunaki cult, red-headed twins who practice incest, descended from Anu, the first murderer, are described as extremely evil and prone to committing murder and incest. After seducing the Scythides, their descendants become the Nephilim, the mighty men, all of whom were destroyed in the flood, as in other works. At the birth of Noah, Lamech prophesied, "He will give us respite from our work and from the labor of our hands in the ground, which the Lord has cursed." Noah had 3 sons, Rekhet, Heti, and Sesheth, and a solar boat. Now God told Anu to get on a boat and start again. He gathered his animals and minions around him, one of each, and sailed away on the water for 100 days. Now his name was Utnapishtim, and he was an Annunaki chief priest, and all the others were his slaves. The gods became afraid and retreated to the heavens of Anu. They huddled together like little dogs, crouching on the outer edge. Ishtar screamed like a woman in labor, and the goddess with a sweet voice lamented, "Alas, the old days have turned to dust because I said bad things in the council of the gods. How could I say bad things in the council of the gods and thereby bring about a catastrophe that would destroy my people? I had barely brought my people into being when they filled the sea like so many fish." The gods, those of the Annunaki, wept with her. Also Shamash the sun god. But the flood washed up in Syria. In Canaan, and you founded the weather cult. But there was another god in Mesopotamia, on the Euphrates, in Mesopotamia. According to legend, Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. He has tremendous intelligence and is very strong, but he oppresses his people. The people call on the gods for help, and the sky god Anu, the chief of the gods, creates a wild man of great strength named Enkidu, who can compete with Gilgamesh. Eventually the two fight, but neither can win. Their enmity turns into homosexual love and then loyal friendship. The two new friends go on many adventures together, but then the gods kill Enkidu. Gilgamesh mourns his friend greatly and realizes that he too must die one day. However, then he hears of one who became immortal, Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood. Gilgamesh goes to the sea to find Utnapishtim, and he tells him about his unusual life and promised him eternal life. Now Gilgamesh was also under the spell of the Annunaki. Better known as Lugal-Zagisi, was now also a slave of the gods. Lugal-Zagisi conquers all of Sumer with his feared Lugal Banda, the Lulubi, and gathered the slaves together on the mountain in Nineveh. The Annunaki assimilated and corrupted the existing gods from Sumeria. Now the gods have returned to earth in the form of malicious temple priests. And now the Annunaki were priest gods and ruled over the Sumerians. They built a ziggurat in every city and were worshipped. Each city-state around Sumer in Mesopotamia had its own god, and every god had its Annunaki chief priest. They created the idol, and now everyone was slaves to the gods. The ultimate believer. He is said to be afraid of the sun. He would have to be born and raised just for the cult. He doesn't need to know anything else. A hollow soul without a will of its own. Anu, the Annunaki high priest, was also known, among other things, as the father of Martu, Era, Baba, Jibal, Nisaba, Enlil, Gatumdu, Lamastu, and the weather god Hadad, as well as the 7 gods. The evil 7 are the sons of the sky god Anu. They eat human flesh and drink blood. When Sin, Samus, and Ishtar tried to share world domination with him and sent his child, the 7 gods, against Sin, which surrounded Sin and caused a lunar eclipse. One stayed, one was bandaged, and one left. Perhaps one died. Sin wandered off. Founded the city of Anshan in Elam. He found a way through the mountains and led the Iranian uprising against the cruel Prince Ajidahaka. Symbolized the fight against the tyranny of evil men and against oppression by foreign invaders. Now he was king and he had 3 sons. Jabal, patron of all nomads. Jubal the bard. And Tubal the blacksmith. Gog and Magog, city and new city, stretched about behind the Caucasus. God once poured iron on the mountain, but now this iron was thawing. Gog and Magog turned northwest and drew the bow around all of Mesopotamia. Now the new city should hit the first wave. The Karaxes came across the Caucasus. A short time later, Gilgamesh is betrayed. 2400 BC. Sargon made from saffron. A cupbearer sneaks into the royal court. He has brought reinforcements from the mountains. Sargon of Akkad himself legitimized the violently usurped rule by citing divine election by the war goddess Inanna of Shem, represented by the Annunaki priestess Esther. She outcompeted the other Annunaki priests. Sargon's wife was Tasloltum, about whom little is known other than her name. The name translates roughly as I took them as prey. According to a legend, Tasloltum was the former wife of Lugal-Zagizi. Sargon, the one with the crown of horns. I am the strong king, the king of Akkad. My mother was an outcast. I didn't know my father. My father's relatives live in the mountains. My birthplace is the city of Saffron, which lies on the banks of the Euphrates. The mother conceived me, the outcast gave birth to me secretly. She put me in a basket made of reeds and closed my openings with asphalt. She left me on the river from which I could no longer climb myself. The river carried me, it brought me to Aki the drawer of water. Verily Aki the water drawer brought me up by dipping the bucket. Aki the water drawer adopted me as his son, he truly raised me. Aki the water drawer truly employed me in his gardening work. During my gardening work Ishtar really grew fond of me. For many years I truly exercised the kingship. I truly dominated and ruled the black-headed people. The temples were plundered and he drove the temple cult followers out of the cities into the mountains. Sargon of Akkad conquered the land and founded the city down the mountain. He had the temples burned down. At his behest, the old customs were rejected and a new order was introduced. First, the sovereign's prerogative over the temples was reversed. The inhabitants were freed from a series of bonded labor and the abusive exploitation of the economically weak by those of higher rank was prohibited. The Akkad Empire slowly collapsed. Many immigrants left the Euphrates and moved on to Anatolia. Others joined the cult of the gods. After Sargon's death, his successor, Naram-Sin, quickly realized that pure military force was not enough. The once sovereign city-states slowly isolated themselves again. The original Uruk cultures slowly re-established themselves. Naram-Sin's successor was his son Sarkalisari, after which the goddess Inanna left Akkad and the people who tolerate no restraints. The Elamites and the Sumerians. A biblical story. Noah and the flood. The Bible tells us that the children of Noah, who repopulate the earth, found a plain in the land of Shinar or Sumer and dwelt there. It is also said, in the Old Testament imagination, the Elamite people are traced back to Shem, who was also a son of Noah. From a strategic point of view, the Elamite capital Susa and Anshan have the mountains behind them and can only be accessed from the south or west. In the west, the Sumerians lived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In the so-called Mesopotamia, the most famous city-states are Kis, Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, which were often at war with each other. The Sumerians are portrayed in the Bible as a warlike and superior people. The sovereign Sumeri city-states maintain their own armies, equipped with spear and shield, as well as helmet and armor, and are inevitably at war with the neighboring Elamites. But the Elamites were not defenseless. Around 2500 BC, when the horse was already kept as an irreplaceable and versatile farm animal in other cultures, people in Mesopotamia tended to rely on donkeys. The fact that the residents of Mesopotamia seemed to have little idea of the usefulness of horses for a relatively long time was certainly due to the fact that horses were not native to this region. So horses initially found their way as booty, as tribute, or through trade from neighboring areas such as the Iranian Zagros Mountains, where the Elamites are native, Anatolia or northern Syria to Mesopotamia. The fact is that Elamite warfare was largely based on bows and arrows. As a Bible text shows, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will destroy the bow of the Elamites, their greatest might." Whether they rode horses or donkeys, or not at all, the bow was a powerful weapon back then. Nevertheless, Elam was repeatedly conquered by the Sumeri rulers of Mesopotamia. But the Elamites were able to retreat further east and survive. About 2300 before Christ, a man reclaimed the throne of Umma. His name is Lugal-Zagisi, also known as Gilgamesh. The 12-part epic was recorded by the Annals and follows his story. Gilgamesh had big plans and marched his army against Lagash. He conquered the city and did something unprecedented. He marched on to Uruk and conquered this city too. So he continued his campaign into northern Mesopotamia and conquered the entire Sumer region. He was the first ruler of an entire region. He is considered the first ruler of all of Sumer and held the title of king of the country. But his reign did not last long. At about the same time, a young cupbearer of the king of Kish arose. He came from northern Sumeria and soon became known as Sargon of Akkad. Sargon referred to himself as the legitimate king. So he soon moved with his army against the usurper, Lugal-Zagisi. The composite bow was a core element of his army, reinforced by axemen, spearmen, and carriers. It is said that he ate at the same table with over 5,000 soldiers every day, and maintained the first standing army. He fought a total of 34 battles, 9 in a single year, until he defeated Lugal-Zagisi and conquered all of Sumer. He founded the capital Akkad, and continued to conquer large parts in the west to the sea, as well as Elam in the east. And his title was the King of the World.
Silence! Your words are meaningless here. Your blood will pay the debt our king demands. Your sacrifice will lift his curse from our land.
General Berato, forgive me, my lord. The king demands your urgent presence.
The gods smile on you. For now. Take this one back to his cell. I'll deal with him later.
You're in luck, Gutian.
Luck? No. No luck for these dogs.
General, we should leave this place. The king, his madness threatens to swallow us all. This temple is cursed.
I'd rather die in this cursed house than perish to the plague and famine out there. We have our orders, Captain.
The moon god sent you to destroy my kingdom. I know it, girl. I see everything. Look around you. Is this hall not famous enough for my mistakes? Do the gods not bask in its glory? The Gutians are coming, General. The moon god sends an army to destroy us.
I shall muster our forces immediately.
Good. And what news from below?
There are hundreds of prisoners, my king. Their sacrifice will take time.
Time is no longer in our hands. No matter. The blood of this army will nourish the sands. The sacrifice will be fulfilled. Starting with this one. Tell me, General, does she remind you of anyone?
My king?
Do you not see a hint of your own daughter in her? What age would she have been now?
18.
18. What a tragedy this plague has been. Kill her.
By your command.
Eventually, the Annunaki gods decided that Akkad must be destroyed to save the other cities of Mesopotamia. The city-states rebelled. In the third generation, the main state of Akkad was destroyed. Independent city-states were formed again, many among the original rulers from Uruk times. Akkad confined itself to Larsa, under Rimsin, the wild bull of the moon god. But the Annunaki god priests were strong and operated from Jamshid in Syria. 1800 BC, the Amorites and Hammurabi appeared. He came from Jamshid, Syria, where the Annunaki chief priest Anu once landed and tricked Gilgamesh, where the weather god Hadad comes from. Jamshid allied with Mari, and Hammurabi conquered Uruk, Isin, and founded the city-state of Babylon. Larsa itself is said to have been defended by 40,000 soldiers. Rim-Sin was the last king of the old Babylonian dynasty of Larsa in Mesopotamia. With its fall, the age of the old Babylonian Empire began. After the rightful king, Sargon of Akkad, later known as the King of the World, defeated the usurper Lugal-Zaggisi, also known as Gilgamesh or the King of the Land. The Akkadian Empire expanded west and east, but generation later it fell apart due to internal unrest. The autonomous Sumerian city-states of the past rose up. The empire sank into chaos and slowly dissolved. When the capital Akkad was destroyed, the empire also collapsed. More and more kings have declared their own kingdoms. The Elam grew stronger again in the east, but it was possible to push back through an alliance of the new empires. The new empires established themselves as equal opponents and often waged war with each other. They fought against each other, but stood together against Elam. Complex diplomatic agreements and protective alliances emerged. The kings had sophisticated networks of ambassadors and agents in all major city-states. Just like Game of Thrones. City walls were built, laws were passed, and wars were waged. Domesticated horses first appeared around 3500 BC, mainly in Central and West Asia, and became more and more important. Just like the chariot, as well as the bow and arrow. The city-state of Larsa soon controlled the Tigris and Euphrates, and thus the two rivers of Mesopotamia, with the power to turn off everyone's water. It was only later that the city-state of Babylon developed into an empire. Through clever diplomacy and alliances, Babylon was able to absorb Upi and Asnuna in the east and gain additional allies with Assur, the Amorites of Mari and Yamhed. It wasn't until 1800 BC that the tyranny of evil men could be ended. Hammurabi, king of Babylon, mobilized his troops. After a pretext for war with Larsa, he sees his chance and goes into battle with his allies. (1800 BC). Mesopotamia. In the inner ranks of the powerful Annunaki, the divine chief priests from Sumerian mythology, tensions and rivalries arose between the moon cult and the sun cult followers. These tensions eventually escalated into an epic conflict, the battle between good and evil, in a massive battle at Larsa, a major site in Mesopotamia. There were 100,000 poor, destitute beggars and savages living in Mesopotamia. They were looking for someone who could explain to them how the world works. Now you are highly religious fanatics who are born, live, and die only for the cult, whether poor or rich. They have divested themselves of all possessions and worship the gods, represented by the Annunaki chief priests. Dressed in rags and armed with stones, they pelted each other brutally, until no one could stand anymore. For the highly fanatical cult followers, retreat was out of the question. They fought to the last man, until death, because you were afraid of the sun. The Annunaki, once united in their rule over the Sumerians, now found themselves caught in a massive power game. The moon cult, whose followers were inspired by the mysterious magic of the moon and fertility, and the sun cult, whose followers were afraid of the sun, mobilized their armies of cult followers and slaves for the inevitable conflict between good and evil and world domination over all minions. The typical cult follower has no possessions. He doesn't need any. He was born for the cult. He should only do what the gods tell him, a hollow, dry soul. The fanatical lackeys gathered in rags. They wielded rusty daggers, and their eyes shone with an eerie determination to please their gods. The Battle of Larsa began with an ominous rumble as cultists from both sides clashed. Rocks flew through the air as the minions skillfully used improvised projectiles and feces to gain the favor of their respective deities. The earth shook under the furious dance of the fanatics. The vast plains outside the walls of Larsa shook with the footsteps of tens of thousands of fanatical cultists sent into battle by Hammurabi and Rimsin to fulfill their religious duty. In honor, King Rimsin the Moon Bull is the last remnant of the Akkadian kingdom. Sargon of Akkad once threw the remaining gods out of the Sumerian cities with the help of the moon goddess Ishtar. He freed the cities from the gods and thus also from the temple priests. The Annunaki god priests were banished to Syria, to Canaan. One day in Syria, Hammurabi came from Jamchad, where Noah landed and founded a sinister cult of the weather god, Al-Hadad. Hammurabi allied himself with the city-state of Mari, which was known for its blacksmithing skills, to finally destroy Larsa for the gift of the goddess. But Larsa was supposedly defended by 40,000 soldiers. Hammurabi is called by a divine mission. He is the first knight. He is the chosen one and needs more cult followers. He needs all of you to end the dark machinations in Sumer and save the world. Both parties recruited their lackeys by the thousands. These fanatical warriors, dressed in rags and filled with an unshakable faith in a better life and the afterlife, had taken to the battlefield to fight for their gods. The situation is serious. The world will end if they don't win. No better life, no life after death. End of the world. In the dusty plains outside the ancient city of Larsa, the armies of Hammurabi and Rimsin rose, dressed in rags and filled with fanatical faith. The sun cast its hot rays onto the battlefield as the warriors formed up in eerie silence. Their simple but deadly armament consisted of carefully collected stones carved with mythical symbols and carried in improvised bags. Hammurabi and Rimsin's armies brutally attacked each other. The cultists held simple stones in their hands, their eyes averted from the sun and imbued with a fanatical glow. Your command, stone unbelievers. The order to attack was given and the first throws flew through the air. Stones slammed into shields, shattered armor, and struck their target in the ranks of enemy warriors. Hammurabi was able to recruit 2 heavy companies with his allies from Mari, Yamchad, and Syria. The heavily armored infantry differed greatly from the ragged lackeys and have-nots. These warriors fought for gold or power. They were well equipped with bronze shields, bronze armor, and bronze helmets, and were among the elite. The armor provided plenty of protection from the hail of stones. Hammurabi also led 2 mounted companies and led his heavily armored riders at the forefront of the battle. Hammurabi filled up the rest with fanatics and lackeys. Rimsin sent one of his generals. He led a mounted company and the legendary warriors from ancient Babylonian myths, the Lalubi Band. A fierce band from the mountains of Ashur, consisting of 2 companies of heavy and light infantry, trained to advance together and encircle their victims. These warriors were better armed than those of Hammurabi. They had iron helmets and their spears had iron tips. They decorated their helmets like chickens and were considered invincible. Rimsin also increased his army with cult followers by the thousands. The decisive battle developed in the center of the violent tsunami between two tree hills. The minions armed with stones sought in vain protection from the stones on both sides and found some of it behind the trees. As the Lalubi band advanced deep into the enemy fanatic ranks, Hammurabi gathered his minions at Tree Hill and gave them one last word of courage and an afterlife before the final decisive attack. He had only one heavy company left and called for the attack. This was supposed to advance with the help of the other lackeys and destroy the enemy. Meanwhile, Hammurabi had to repeatedly fend off attacks from the Lalubi gang. These were superior to the simple minions, and Hammurabi's job was to protect his followers. The heavily armed warriors were severely thinned on both sides, until only a few remained, fighting for their lives. Daggers flashed in the sunlight and small axes whirled through the air as the fanatical warriors charged at one another. The dust of battle mingled with the blood of the fallen as the cultists fought with relentless fervor for their gods. Every blow, every stab, was accompanied by a deep belief in their gods. The battle was a veritable storm of chaos and death. Rags became makeshift bandages for wounds, and the earth shook under the constant pounding of the combatants. The scene was one of bloody frenzy and an ominous will to win. A menacing roar echoed across the battlefield as the two armies clashed. The ground shook under the rapid footsteps of the fanatical warriors, their rags flapping in the wind as they pelted each other with stones. The stones flew wildly through the air like deadly projectiles as the warriors fearlessly made their way through the dust and chaos. Hammurabi's followers fought with fierce determination, their faces suffused with a fanatical glow. They only knew one sentence: "Yes, mister," and were afraid of the sun. They always kept their eyes down and aimed low. Rimsin's warriors, however, were equally determined to defend their city. In order to maximize their army capacity, they worshipped the fertility cult, and as a reward there was sex, as well as 66 virgins after death. The battle became a desperate struggle for survival, with every throw of a stone sealing a warrior's fate. It was clear that the losers would all die for heresy. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing stones, cries of war, and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. The ground around Larsa was littered with rags, dust, and the remains of fanatical warriors. The sun began to dip towards the horizon as the battle reached its climax. The stones rushed through the air, crushing shields, shattering armor, and finding their targets in the ranks of the enemy warriors. A deafening clang and clap filled the scene, accompanied by the shrill screams of the fanatics. But despite the hail of stones, the warriors refused to take a step back. As the minions' supplies of stone were exhausted, an oppressive silence fell over the battlefield. The cult followers of Hammurabi and Rimsin stood face to face and, based on an ancient temple pact, they simultaneously emptied their hands of the improvised projectiles. Then the second phase of the battle began. Now the battle turned into hand-to-hand combat. Daggers met axes, and the skies above Larsa lit with sparks from the conflict-filled clash. The divine Annunaki, who once ruled over humanity as a unit, now found their followers caught in a violent play of the elements. After the stone supplies were exhausted, a grim silence fell over the battlefield. An eerie crunch sounded as the fanatical warriors drew their daggers and small axes. The atmosphere became even more threatening as the armies engaged in hand-to-hand combat. The dust swirled as the warriors charged at each other with unparalleled abandon. Despite serious wounds or the loss of arms and legs, the madmen lashed out wildly. Nobody was safe anymore. Daggers flashed in the brilliant sunlight and small axes swung in a deadly dance. Every blow was accompanied by a sheer desire for superiority and the will to win. The battle took a cruel turn as the warriors were locked in deadly hand-to-hand combat. Rags became makeshift bandages for the wounds, and the ground was littered with the remains of the fanatical warriors who fought to the last breath. Finally, as the sun sank behind the craggy walls of Larsa, the battlefield lay silent and deserted. Those who still breathed were stained with blood and filled with unshakable faith. The battle between Hammurabi and Rimsin at Larsa would go down as a dark chapter in the chronicles of antiquity, marked by fanatical zeal and an unstoppable will to die in battle. Despite the exhaustion and losses, the fanatical warriors fought to the last man. Those who could still stand continued their desperate struggle, ready to sacrifice their lives for the faith and their gods. In the end, the battlefield was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind across the plains of Larsa. At the end of the day, when the dust settled and the stars appeared in the sky, the battlefield of Larsa lay littered with the remains of the fanatical warriors. The Annunaki, once worshipped as gods, had lost their followers in a massive conflict. The inner differences of the gods had forever shaped the destinies of people on Earth. Hammurabi was ultimately able to win all battles and conquer Larsa. The world is saved, he has driven away evil. And with that the old Babylonian Empire was founded. Hammurabi emerged victorious from the conflict and conquered Sumer. He had the remaining fanatics crucified or imprisoned and introduced the Code of Hammurabi. The rest of Rimsim's followers fled northeast over the mountains and drew the bow. But this is another story. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest written legal texts that goes back to a single ruler. He was founded by Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon in the 18th century BC. Enacted. The Code of Hammurabi is engraved on a stone monument and contains a total of 282 laws that regulate various aspects of civil, economic, and family life. Here are some examples of provisions from the Code of Hammurabi. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is one of the most famous provisions in the Code of Hammurabi and is often interpreted as a principle of retribution. It means that the punishment for a crime should correspond to the harm caused to the victim. Property rights. The code contains laws that govern ownership and trade, including theft and fraud. There are clear regulations and penalties for thieves. Family matters. The code also regulates family relationships and matters such as marriage, divorce, and paternity. It also contains provisions for the protection of women and children. Occupational law. There are laws that relate to employment contracts and pay. The code also contains regulations for craftsmen and builders. Religious provisions. Some laws in the code are religious in nature and regulate people's behavior regarding cult and religious practices. It is important to note that the punishments in the Code of Hammurabi are often drastic and differ from modern legal concepts. However, the Codex is an important historical document that provides insights into the jurisprudence and social life of ancient Mesopotamia. If you don't want to miss the next epic battle then, you know and leave a like. See you next time. Rim-Sin was the last king of the old Babylonian dynasty of Larsa in Mesopotamia. With its fall, the age of the old Babylonian Empire began. The Codex Yuarnamu is the oldest written legal collection and was introduced by Hammurabi. The Sumerian cult of the weather god once arose in the Syrian region. People settled by the sea and paid homage to the weather god of water and rivers. He was different from the weather god from northern Syria. There they worshipped a similar version of the weather god, but this one stood for lightning, storms, and thunder, where the bows and chariots come from. North of the Caucasus, Perun or Rama is the supreme god of Slavic mythology. He is the god of storms, thunder, and lightning. His symbols include the iris, the axe, and the oak tree. His name means the one who hits hard. The oldest written tradition comes from the 6th century BC. Procopius of Caesarea reports about a thunder god, whom the Slavs worship as the only deity and to whom they offer animal sacrifices. Where the meteorite once hit and the iron was found, they joined together to form the Hittite League. Among the Slavs who once immigrated from the Caucasus Mountains, the first Hittite settlement arose on the Anatolian mountains under a king under Caraxes, Hattians, and Hurrians. 1600 BC, with the new power of iron, the king of the Hittites went to Babylon and laid waste the city. After the capture of Babylon, he succumbed to an assassination attempt and several regional rulers of the Hutti were established. Babylon fell to the Kassites. The Kassites were the most impious of the barbarians and plundered the remaining temples for the next 400 years. This was also the end of the old Babylonian Empire. The Amorites and the Annunaki priests were driven out of Babylon to Canaan, where they joined forces with the Hyksos, it is said of crowns of horns, and conquered the upper parts of Egypt. At this time, the biblical Abraham also fled Ur. But this is another story.